Let me tell you something jaw-dropping. Something that happened in a parliamentary chamber that Washington was absolutely not prepared for. Donald Trump went on Truth Social and, surprise, surprise, he called Canada's entire dairy industry a, quote, deliberate act of agricultural theft against the United States. Agricultural theft. That was the phrase. And Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former central banker who has spent his career making high-stakes arguments in front of audiences that demand evidence, not emotion, he was handed that post mid-session, read it for 15 seconds, set it down, and didn't get angry. He didn't dodge. He didn't give some mealy-mouthed diplomatic non-answer. He pulled out facts, specific, sourced, statistically precise facts. And what followed over the next 30 minutes was, and I'm not exaggerating here, one of the most remarkable trade policy exchanges in modern North American history. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why Trump's argument doesn't just fall apart, it collapses under the weight of America's own numbers. Okay, so here is exactly what happened and why it matters. Trump posted on Truth Social calling Canada's supply management system, the system that governs milk, cheese, butter, chicken, turkey, and eggs, the single most unfair trade arrangement in the entire North American relationship. He called it a hidden tax on American farmers. He called it a rigged market. And then he dropped that phrase, agricultural theft. Now, Mark Carney was right in the middle of parliamentary question period when this post went live. An aide hands him a printed copy, he reads it. 15 seconds. He sets it down and then, calmly, unhurriedly, with the energy of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment, he responded. Not with outrage, not with defensiveness, with facts. He acknowledged right out of the gate that Canadian dairy policy was a legitimate subject of bilateral discussion, and then he added, and this got a laugh from the Canadian side of the chamber, that the appropriate forum for that discussion was a trade negotiation, not a social media post. And that, my friends, was just the warm-up, because what came next was a three-part factual dismantling so thorough and so precise that even economists who criticized Canada's dairy system called it the most effective trade policy rebuttal they had ever witnessed. Now here's where things get genuinely interesting, and this is the part that American media is completely glossing over. Canada's supply management system has been running since the early 1970s, 50 years, and the way it works is through three interlocking mechanisms: production quotas, import controls, and price stabilization. The goal? Keep Canadian family farms financially viable by making sure the price farmers receive actually covers the cost of producing the product. And here's the real kicker. The Canadian government doesn't write checks to dairy farmers. It's not a subsidy in the conventional sense. It manages the market structure so farmers can plan, invest, and operate with income certainty. And what is 50 years of that system produced?
This land's been in our family for generations.
Are predominantly family-owned and
one day it'll be yours.
The average Canadian dairy farm has been in continuous family operation for over 30 years. Not wealthy, but stable, able to service debt, invest in equipment, send their kids to college, and retire with dignity. Now, compare that to the American system. The United States lost approximately 50% of its dairy farms between 2003 and 2023. American dairy farmers frequently receive prices for their milk below the cost of production, surviving only through direct federal subsidy payments, $6 billion a year in government checks. So Trump is calling Canada's system protectionist? Let me tell you, the numbers tell a very different story. So how did the political world react? Let me paint you a picture. In the Canadian Parliament, the reaction cut across partisan lines in a way that almost never happens. Conservative MPs, members of Parliament from rural dairy farming constituencies, people whose political existence depends on defending supply management, found themselves in the uncomfortable position
$6 billion
of having
per year in
absolutely
U.S. federal
nothing
dairy
to
subsidies,
criticize
a
about
massive,
liberal
ongoing
Prime
government
Minister's
investment.
trade response. Several issued statements of qualified support for Carney's factual rebuttal. Think about that. Political opponents praising the government's response. The National Farmers Union called it, and I'm going to be careful with their words here, the most effective public defense of supply management they had witnessed from any prime minister in the system's 50-year history. The dairy farmers of Canada confirmed that Carney cited every figure accurately. And even economists who have published critiques of supply management acknowledged that the comparative framing, Canadian farm stability versus American farm bankruptcy rates, was, quote,
My fellow
"factually
Canadians,
accurate
we must
and
prioritize
rhetorically
economic
devastating."
stability and public
Now,
safety
what about
in these
Washington?
challenging times.
Washington followed the now familiar pattern. The White House press secretary called Carney's remarks combative and unhelpful. The U.S. Trade Representative's office reiterated that Canadian dairy barriers cost American farmers billions. And Trump posted 3 more statements throughout the afternoon, each one escalating in language, each one decreasing in specificity. No new tariffs announced, no formal trade action, just words, loud, increasingly vague words. Okay, here's the real kicker. And this is where Carney's argument goes from good to extraordinary. He didn't stop at defending supply management. He went bigger. He laid out a pattern, a systematic double standard that Canada has been quietly absorbing for years and has now decided, loudly, precisely, without apology, to name out loud. Here is the framework he presented, and I want you to really hear this. Supply management is called protectionist by Washington. American dairy subsidies are called farmer support. Canadian steel protections are called unfair trade barriers. American steel tariffs are called national security. Canadian pharmaceutical pricing regulations are called market distortion. American pharmaceutical patent extensions are called innovation incentives. Do you see the pattern?
Good afternoon. We'll start with
Every single
questions.
Canadian
Can you clarify
trade
the timeline
intervention
on the
gets labeled
infrastructure
as a
bill?
violation
And the funding
of
details?
free trade
Certainly.
principles. Every single American trade intervention gets labeled as smart sovereign policy. And Carney said, calmly, looking directly at the record, that Canada was entirely willing to have a serious conversation about any of these policies in any context where the same standard was applied to both nations simultaneously. What Canada was not willing to do
Canada's
was accept
protectionist
a framework
policies include
where
high tariffs
American
and
trade
subsidies, while the U.S.
interventions
promotes
were
smart
treated
policy
as
with lower
legitimate,
tariffs and
while
innovation.
Canadian ones were treated as violations of a free trade principle that the United States itself had not practiced for decades. That argument is impossible to refute without acknowledging the double standard, and Washington knows it. Let me be direct with you about what this actually means, because the dairy fight is not really about dairy. It never was. This is a test case for a much larger and much more consequential question. Does Canada have the sovereign right to organize its domestic economy according to its own democratic values and priorities? Or does American export interest have some kind of overriding claim on Canadian market structure, a claim that supersedes Canadian democratic choices? Because that is the argument Trump is making when he calls supply management agricultural theft. He's not making an economic argument. He's making a power argument. He's saying your sovereign democratic policy choice is illegitimate because it inconveniences American exporters. And here's why that should alarm every single person watching this video, regardless of where you stand politically. If that argument is allowed to stand unchallenged, if Canada just absorbs it the way it has for years, It establishes a precedent. It says that the United States can designate any foreign nation's domestic economic policy as an act of aggression simply because it limits American market access. That is not free trade. That is economic coercion dressed up in trade language. And Carney's response, precise, evidence-based, publicly delivered in the most visible parliamentary forum available, is not confrontational. It is democratic. It is a government using the factual record to defend its citizens' right to make their own choices about how their food system works. That is what accountability to the public actually looks like. And here is the final piece, the detail that nobody is talking about enough. When Carney cited the comparative outcome data in that parliamentary chamber, the numbers that landed with the force of, and I mean this, a precision instrument, it wasn't just the $6.2 billion in annual federal support flowing to American dairy. It was the farm closure data side by side. Canadian dairy farm bankruptcies over the past 20 years? Essentially zero. American dairy farm closures over the same period? Approximately 60,000 operations, representing half of all American dairy farms that existed at the start of that period. And Carney looked directly at the chamber and delivered the line that made the opposition benches erupt and the government benches go very, very quiet, which in parliamentary terms means the point landed exactly as intended. He said that before a country lectures its neighbor about agricultural policy, it might want to examine whether its own system is actually working for its own farmers. 60,000 farm closures, half the industry, gone in 20 years under the system Trump is defending as superior. In an even wilder twist, Washington had no new numbers to offer in response, just the same talking points repeated louder. The facts were always available. What changed is that Canada is now using them. So here is where we stand. Trump called Canadian dairy policy an act of agricultural theft. Carney responded with the quota access figures that Canada already provides under the CUSMA trade agreement that the Trump administration itself signed and called a great deal. He cited the $6.2 billion in annual federal support flowing to American dairy. He cited the 60,000 American farm closures. And he connected the dairy defense to a broader, unassailable principle. No nation that practices its own forms of agricultural support has standing to demand that its neighbor abandon theirs. Washington called it combative. Canadian farmers called it accurate, and the markets registered it as another data point in a pattern that is now 18 months long and showing absolutely no signs of reversing. The old diplomatic deference, the habit of absorbing American criticism without systematic factual rebuttal, that is over. Not replaced by hostility, not replaced by confrontation for its own sake, replaced by something that is, in some ways, far more challenging for Washington to manage. Facts, delivered calmly, with comparative context, that make the double standard visible and impossible to ignore. If this breakdown helped you understand what is really at stake beneath the dairy headlines, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me whether you think Washington has any factual response to Carney's numbers, because I genuinely want to know what you think. And subscribe, because this story is moving fast and the next exchange is already forming.